Grace Whitmore laughed when Dominic Hale stood at the dock with oil on his hands, warning her that the million-dollar yacht should not leave the marina. To her, he was nothing more than a broke single father who had come to fix an engine and decided to make himself important in front of wealthy guests. But 6 hours later, far out at sea in the dark, every electrical system on the yacht went dead. The engines stopped. Waves slammed against the hull, and when Grace heard the name of the only person who could save them, the smirk was gone. Don't skip this story, because the most overlooked person turned out to be the only one keeping everyone alive. Newport, Rhode Island wore its wealth quietly in October, the way old money always does in salt air and white hulls, in the soft creak of rope against cleat, in the unhurried movements of men who had been tending boats their entire lives. The marina at Bayside Point was one of the finest on the East Coast, its slips lined with vessels whose names were printed in gold leaf, and whose maintenance costs exceeded the annual salaries of the people who serviced them. The Celestia dominated slip 14 the way a cathedral dominates a block. She was a 112-foot motor yacht, with a white hull so clean it looked freshly painted every morning, floor-to-ceiling black glass panels along her main deck, teak flooring buffed to amber, and an interior that a design magazine had once described as a floating 5-star hotel. She belonged to Grace Whitmore, and she looked exactly like something Grace Whitmore would own. Dominic Hale arrived at 6:47 in the morning, in a 10-year-old gray pickup truck. He parked in the service lot away from the valet area, which was the only lot available to tradesmen, and which he had used enough times to know without being told. His tool bag sat in the truck bed under a canvas tarp alongside a rubber mat, a coil of marine-grade wire, and a paper bag that held a thermos and a foil-wrapped breakfast sandwich he had made quickly before waking Madison. On the back seat, small and bright blue against the worn upholstery, was his daughter's jacket. Madison Hale was 6 years old, and she had her father's dark eyes and her late mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. Her school had called a teacher planning day, which meant she had spent the morning asking her father what electrical fault meant and whether the ocean was always cold. Dominic had answered both questions as carefully as he answered every question she asked, because he believed children deserved real explanations, not soft deflections. He had set up a folding chair for her near the edge of the service yard, close enough to see him but far from any equipment. She had her backpack, a library book about deep-sea creatures, and the promise of ice cream afterward if she was patient. She settled in without complaint. She had done this before. Dominic himself was 32, lean in the way that men who work with their hands go lean, with the kind of quiet that was not shyness, but rather the careful economy of someone who had learned not to spend words on things that did not require them. He was known among the smaller marinas along this stretch of coast, not because he advertised or held any particular certification, but because he had once repaired a hydraulic stabilizer on a 60-foot sailing vessel in 2 hours after the manufacturer's authorized technician had given up and gone home. Word traveled in the boating community. He had not been hired directly by whoever owned the Celestia. Owen Brooks, who ran a modest repair operation 2 slips down, had been asked to send someone to do a preliminary check on a secondary electrical panel that had thrown a warning light the previous evening. Owen had called Dominic because Owen trusted Dominic the way you trust someone you have watched work in difficult conditions without panicking. Grace Whitmore arrived 40 minutes later, and everything about her entrance announced that she moved through the world at a different velocity than the people who serviced it. She was 29, with a posture that suggested she had been taught from childhood to take up space without apology. She walked at the center of a moving formation that included 2 personal assistants, a security manager in a dark suit, and a media crew filming behind-the-scenes content for a product launch. Behind them came a cluster of investors in business attire, men and women who had been invited to witness a coastal resort announcement Grace had spent months preparing. Dominic watched the procession from the edge of the service dock. He noted the crew with the camera. He noted that no one had told him the boat was departing on a media event today, only that it needed a quick inspection. He picked up his tool bag and headed for the gangway. The hatch to the engine room was aft of the main salon, accessed through a heavy door that took some effort to open and released a warm mechanical smell when it did. Dominic descended the steel ladder with the practiced ease of a man who had been in hundreds of engine rooms over the years, and he stood at the bottom for a moment, letting his senses adjust. Most problems introduced themselves before you looked at a single gauge. The smell was the first thing. Faint, but present. The thin, acrid note of insulation that had been running hotter than it should for longer than it should. Not a burning smell, not yet, but the shadow of one. The way smoke precedes a fire by hours. He moved along the port side first, past the main generator casing, running his eyes and one gloved hand along the cabling runs. The wiring here was not original. The vessel had undergone a refit several years ago, and the secondary electrical systems had been updated in a way that did not entirely match the original design drawings. He had seen this before on boats that changed hands frequently. Someone always adds something. Someone always improvises a junction or reroutes a supply run through a conduit that was not designed for it. The cooling line for the generator was what stopped him. It was a half-inch hose connecting the raw water intake to the heat exchanger, held in place by a stainless hose clamp that showed the white crystal deposits of saltwater intrusion around its band. The seal had been failing slowly, for weeks or possibly months, allowing moisture to reach the electrical contacts behind it. The metal of the clamp had oxidized past the point of reliability. If the engine was loaded hard and coolant flow dropped even slightly, that clamp would let go. He crouched and examined the bilge. Thin but present, a sheen on the water that told him oil was mixing from somewhere. Not a catastrophe, but a slow insult to the system that no one had addressed. The bilge pump was running. It was handling it. For now, he moved to the backup generator. When he placed his palm on the housing, he felt it before he heard it, a vibration in the wrong register. A slight roughness in the rotation that experienced hands recognized as a bearing showing early fatigue. The exhaust elbow on the same unit had a faint soot ring at the joint, which indicated it had been running rich intermittently. He found the secondary breaker panel near the forward bulkhead and opened it with his multimeter. 2 of the 8 breakers showed heat discoloration on their terminals. One had a scorch mark that someone had painted over, or possibly had not noticed at all. He checked the bilge pump wiring. The control line ran through a section of the bilge where standing moisture was clearly recurrent, and the jacket on the wire was soft in a way that meant the insulation was degrading. He climbed back up and asked one of the deckhands to find him the captain. Adrian Cole was a trim man in his 50s with silver at his temples, and the careful authority of someone who had commanded vessels long enough to become very good at managing the expectations of wealthy clients. He listened to Dominic with his arms loosely crossed and his eyes attentive, and Dominic respected that. He laid out what he had found: the compromised coolant clamp, the bearing fatigue in the backup unit, the wet bilge wiring, the scorched breakers. He was specific, sequential, not dramatic. He recommended that the departure be delayed by 4 to 6 hours. Adrian nodded slowly. Then Hunter Pierce walked in. Hunter was Grace's operations and security manager, and he walked the way men walk when they have learned that physical confidence is a form of authority. He looked at Dominic, at his boots, his worn collar, his tool bag, and asked him which manufacturer had certified his assessment. Dominic said he had worked extensively on this engine series on commercial vessels, including a Coast Guard auxiliary tender. Hunter smiled, with only the lower half of his face. He said that sounded like a man padding his resume. Dominic did not raise his voice. He said, "If the generator cooling system fails offshore under full event load, she loses primary power, then secondary navigation, then stable communication. After that, it stops being a business problem." Hunter walked out without answering. Grace was on the forward deck, speaking to her media team, when Adrian approached her with the news that a technician was recommending a delay. She turned from the camera setup with the expression of a person who has been interrupted mid-sentence, which was how she experienced most inconveniences. The main deck of the Celestia was set for an event. Champagne glasses were arranged on a white draped table. A retractable screen was positioned to display renderings of the coastal resort project. 12 guests in business formal stood in loose clusters, some photographing the horizon, some speaking in the quiet tones of people who were already calculating how much money they might commit to this morning's pitch. Dominic came up from below and stood on the teak deck. He was the only person present not wearing a blazer. His forearms were visible below his rolled sleeves, and there was a thin line of grease along the back of his left hand from where he had braced himself against the generator housing. Grace looked at him the way she sometimes looked at an incorrect item that had been delivered to her office, not with cruelty, but with the particular blankness of a person for whom certain categories of presence are not entirely legible. She asked him to explain the problem. Dominic explained it, in the same terms he had used with Adrian, with the same measured specificity. He watched her face as he spoke, and he could see she was listening but not yet hearing, in the way that people listen to information that threatens something they have already decided. When he finished, Grace asked him if he knew what this charter was worth. Dominic said he did not. He said it did not change the condition of the coolant clamp. Grace tilted her head. One of the investors near the rail smiled slightly at that, as if he found the exchange mildly amusing. Hunter appeared at the edge of the deck. Grace said, "You're telling me you found a faulty hose clamp and that I should delay a $150,000 event." Dominic said, "I'm telling you the hose clamp is one part of a connected system, and if that system fails at sea under high load, you will lose power and control." Hunter said, "This is a contract maintenance worker trying to justify more billable hours." Dominic said nothing. Grace's voice changed then, not louder, but flatter, with the particular precision of someone delivering a social judgment they are certain will land. She said that Dominic might be very good at fixing fishing boats, but the Celestia was not a fishing boat, and she was not going to delay a major investor presentation because a single-father handyman with an oil stain on his cuff decided to become a safety expert that morning. The deck was quiet for a moment. Dominic did not look at Grace. He looked past her shoulder to the service yard below, where Madison had looked up from her book. The little girl could not have heard the words, not at that distance, but she could read the geometry of the situation. The cluster of adults in fine clothes, her father standing slightly apart, the way several people were looking at him. Her expression was the expression of a child trying to determine if her parent needed protecting. Dominic looked back at Grace. He said, "I've told you what I found. That's all I'm here to do." He took the folded page from his shirt pocket, a handwritten technical note with the items he had identified, the location of each, and the phone number for Owen's yard, and set it on the chart table near the helm station. Hunter picked it up. He glanced at it, then dropped it into the small stainless trash receptacle next to the bar cart. Grace told Adrian to prepare for departure. Dominic walked down the gangway. When he reached the service yard, Madison stood up and came to him. She reached for his hand and said, very quietly, that there had been a lot of people looking at him. He said he knew. She asked whether he had been right, though. He said, "Whether I was right or wrong doesn't matter as much as whether I tried to stop something dangerous." That part I did. She thought about this, then nodded, which was the closest she came to saying she accepted an explanation. They walked toward the truck to get ice cream. The Celestia left the marina at 9:42 in the morning, under a sky that was clean and cold and brilliant. The sound system on the main deck played something orchestral at a tasteful volume. A deckhand moved among the guests with a tray of glasses. The hull made its soft displacement sound against the water as it moved into the channel. For the first hour, the boat ran well, and the guests began to relax in the way that people relax when they have been taken from the complications of ordinary life and placed on a surface that moves beneath them. Grace stood at the bow, rehearsed her remarks, and felt the irritation of the morning begin to dissolve in the salt air. In the engine room, the machinery ran. The main generator turned under full load as the air conditioning cycled through 5 cabin zones. The commercial kitchen prepared a brunch service. The media equipment hummed through its warm-up cycle, and the presentation screens awaited their cue. The temperature gauge for the primary generator moved upward by 3 degrees over 40 minutes within the warning threshold range, but movement in the wrong direction. The single deckhand, assigned to monitor the engine room, did not flag it. He had been told before departure to let the boat run. Hunter told guests that the dock technician had been an eccentric, trying to delay the departure for unclear reasons. Several people found this amusing. He said the boat was fine. He believed it while he said it, which was the most dangerous part. Back at the service dock, Dominic ate his ice cream in the driver's seat, while Madison narrated what she was reading about anglerfish. Owen walked over and leaned against the tailgate. Dominic mentioned, briefly, what had happened aboard the Celestia. Owen said he hoped Dominic was wrong. Dominic said, "So do I." He looked out at the channel. The white hull of the Celestia was visible in the distance, moving steadily southeast. He watched it until it was gone. 3 hours and 11 minutes after departure, Grace stood at the center of the main deck and began her presentation. The screens behind her displayed renderings of white sand beaches and glass-walled villas. She spoke about vision, about the future of luxury travel, about the particular courage it took to build something meaningful instead of merely profitable. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The lights on the main deck flickered. It was brief, less than a second, and it was followed immediately by the presentation screen going dark and then recovering. Someone in the guest cluster made a small sound of surprise. Someone else laughed softly, the way you laugh when something slightly unsettling happens in a safe context. Hunter said it was a minor load transfer. Grace paused, then continued, but something in her rhythm was gone, and she heard it herself. Below deck, the temperature on the primary generator had crossed the upper warning threshold. The cooling line was restricting. The weakened clamp had allowed the hose to shift very slightly at the fitting under the vibration load of the full power run, and the raw water flow was no longer reaching full volume. Catherine Rowe had been standing near the starboard rail, watching the lights flicker. She was 51 years old and had spent 3 decades managing financial risk for people who did not always want accurate assessments of it. She crossed the deck to Grace and said quietly, "The man this morning. What did he say would fail first?" Grace said, "The generator cooling system." Catherine said, "And then what?" Grace did not answer, but her jaw moved slightly. The lights flickered again, this time for 3 seconds. The music cut out. The air conditioning cycled off and did not immediately cycle back on. A faint smell drifted through the ventilation registers, thin, industrial, wrong. Adrian appeared from the pilot station. His face carried the controlled neutral of someone who was deciding how much to say. Grace stood at the rail and felt the space between her certainty and the actual situation widen by a measurable distance. The primary generator failed at 2:17 in the afternoon. It did not announce itself dramatically. There was a sound from below that those on deck might have described as a heavy concussive thump, the kind of sound a machine makes when a component lets go under pressure rather than burning through. It was followed by a hard vibration through the deck plating that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and then stopped. And then the lights went out. Not all of them. The emergency circuit stayed live, casting the interior in the amber wash of battery-backed safety lighting. But the main salons went dark. The presentation screens went dark. The air conditioning stopped entirely. And across the instrument panel in the pilot station, Adrian watched the primary power indicators drop to 0, one by one. He activated the backup generator immediately. It started. It ran. For 6 minutes it carried the reduced load of the emergency systems, and then the bearing, the one that Dominic had noticed vibrating in the wrong register that morning, gave out with a sound that even the guests on the upper deck could hear. A groan. Then a rattle. Then silence. The Celestia was now running on battery reserve alone. The guests reacted in the way that groups of relatively composed people react when something genuinely frightening happens, with a brief, sharp disruption of composure that some of them managed to contain and others did not. A woman knocked over a champagne glass. Two people moved toward the life jacket storage without being told to, which was perhaps the most accurate measure of how serious the moment felt. Catherine's voice cut through the noise with the tone of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where panic was expensive. She told everyone to sit down and move to the lower salon. Several people obeyed immediately. The weather that had been building from the northwest arrived. Not a storm, but a sequence of swells that pushed the broadside of the drifting vessel in a way that made standing difficult. Glasses rolled off surfaces. Someone braced against a doorframe. Grace went below. The engine room was lit by flashlights cutting through steam and the soft haze of heat radiating from the stalled generator. A deckhand was on his knees with a rag, trying to slow a spray of coolant from the very fitting Dominic had identified that morning. The clamp had failed completely. Salt water and hot coolant were mixing and spreading toward the secondary electrical panel. A young technician named Garrett looked up at Grace when she came down the ladder. She could see in his face the kind of fear that competent people feel when they hit the edge of their competence. She asked, "Can you fix it?" Garrett said, "Not without someone who knows how this system was modified. The refit changed the cooling circuit, and I don't have the updated schematics." Catherine appeared at the top of the ladder. She said, "We need to contact the Marine Service Yard. Owen Brooks, at Bayside Point." Hunter started to say something. No one in the room looked at him. Adrian had the emergency handheld radio. He managed a broken transmission through the weather static, getting enough information to Bayside Point that the situation was understood. Grace took the handset after Adrian lowered it. She stood in the amber-lit corridor and thought about the folded sheet of paper with handwritten notes that Hunter had dropped into a trash can. She thought about the pair of hands that had made those notes. Calloused, steady hands with a thin line of grease on the knuckle that she had looked at and used as evidence of everything she already believed. She said into the radio, "Please find Dominic Hale." Owen's yard was quiet when the call came through. Madison had fallen asleep in the office chair, with her library book open across her stomach. Dominic was in the repair bay fitting a new impeller to a shallow draft inboard, and he heard Owen's voice change before he heard the words. Owen came to the door and said, "The Celestia. They're adrift, primary and backup both down. Position is roughly 15 to 17 miles southeast. Weather coming in from the northwest." Dominic set the impeller on the workbench. He asked, "Temperature in the engine room, water level in the bilge, whether the smell of burning was spreading or contained, and how long since the backup had failed." The answers came back. Hot but not burning. Bilge pump still functional on reserve. Smell contained to the engine space. Backup had failed approximately 22 minutes ago. Dominic said, "They have maybe 90 minutes on the reserve battery before the bilge pump loses power. After that, the water in the keel space starts to matter." He was already moving toward his truck for the waterproof kit bag he kept behind the seat. Grace's voice came through on the radio, and Dominic heard it. He had expected it to sound commanding, the way it had on the deck that morning. Instead, it sounded like the voice of someone at the edge of what they knew how to manage. He took the radio from Owen and told Grace to disconnect the shore power bridge switch. Direct all remaining battery reserve to bilge pump and emergency radio only. Move all guests to the forward salon. Keep the engine room door cracked enough to monitor smoke and not attempt to restart either generator. Grace said, "Understood." It was a single word, but something in the way she said it had changed. Madison had woken up. She stood in the doorway of the office in her jacket, the library book held against her chest, watching her father load the waterproof bag. She came to him and said, "You're going out there." Dominic crouched down to her level. He said, "There are 31 people on a boat, with no power and weather coming in. I know what's wrong with the boat." She said, "But they were mean to you." He said, That doesn't change what they need." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the small yellow cloth handkerchief from her jacket pocket and held it out to him. He took it. He folded it and put it in his breast pocket. She said, "Come back, okay?" He said, "I'll come back." He walked to the dock. The rescue tender was a 31-foot utility craft, fast in fair weather and manageable in the kind of chop that was building. Dominic rowed it, standing in the covered pilot house with one hand on the overhead grip and his eyes on the chart plotter. The swells were 3 to 4 feet, with occasional sets reaching 5. And the sky had the flat lead color that October afternoons develop when weather is pushing in from inland. He used the transit time to reconstruct the engine room in his memory. He had been in it for perhaps 45 minutes that morning, but he had the kind of spatial recall that came from years of working in confined mechanical spaces where mistakes had consequences. He knew the primary coolant shutoff location. He knew the routing of the secondary electrical feed. He knew the position of the manual bilge override switch, relocated during the refit, and not labeled in any obvious way. He had written all of this on the folded paper that Hunter Pierce had dropped in the trash. When the tender rounded the last leg of the approach bearing, the Celestia came into view, and the sight of her was startling. She was familiar. White hull, black glass, teak deck, but she was adrift, bow swinging wide with the swells. No navigation lights active, only the amber glow of emergency lighting visible through the aft windows. On the main deck, a figure appeared at the rail. A woman in a blazer, both hands gripping the rail, watching the tender approach. It was the first time Grace Whitmore had been the one waiting for someone. The transfer from the tender to the Celestia in 4-foot swells required timing the rhythm of the boats rising and falling against each other, waiting for the peak of the tender's rise to match the base of the yacht's descent. Dominic timed it, moved, and was halfway up the ladder when the tender dropped on a trough and his weight went briefly unsupported. He swung, shoulder catching the aluminum hull rung. He felt the impact in the rotator cuff and kept climbing. He came over the rail onto the deck. Grace was standing 4 feet away. She started to say something. Dominic said, "How many people total? Anyone unaccounted for? What's the water level at the aft bilge inspection point?" She answered all 3 questions without hesitation. He said, "Take me below." The engine room had the temperature and smell of a space that had been running hard and been forced to stop. Residual heat, the ghost of scorched insulation, the persistent mist of saline vapor that comes when seawater contacts hot metal surfaces. Dominic moved through it with the unhurried pace of a person who measures before he acts. He confirmed what he had expected. The hose clamp had separated from the cooling inlet at the fitting, exactly where he had seen the oxidation and salt crystal buildup that morning. The raw water spray had reached the wiring loom that fed the secondary distribution panel. 3 circuits were shorted. The primary generator had shut down on thermal protection. The backup generator's bearing had disintegrated. That unit was finished. He turned to Adrian, who was standing at the aft bulkhead, with his left arm held carefully against his ribs. His face pale, but attentive. Dominic said, "I can't restore full power. I can isolate the shorted circuits, get the bilge pump back on dedicated feed, give you navigation lights and radio. That's the priority list." Adrian said, "What about propulsion?" Dominic said, "Not today. The tow line is the propulsion." He began working. He asked for a specific wrench, 7/16" box end, and Grace found it in the tool bag and handed it to him without being asked. He noticed that she watched what he was doing rather than looking away, and that she retained the information from watching and was ready with the next item before he requested it. At a certain point, he needed someone to hold the emergency flashlight at a specific angle into the wiring cavity behind the secondary panel, and he asked Grace to do it. She said, "How do I hold it?" He said, 45 degrees down, steady, don't let it drift." She did it. She held it for 11 minutes without moving. Hunter appeared at the engine room doorway. He said something about keeping guests informed of the timeline. Dominic did not look up. He said, "I need you to keep people away from this space and away from the companionway aft. If you want to be useful, that's what useful looks like right now." Hunter left. Dominic found the manual bilge override switch behind the relocated inspection plate, exactly where the refit had moved it, exactly where he had noted it in the folded paper. He shifted the bilge pump to isolated battery feed. The sound of it changed, steadier, stronger, no longer sharing current with the failing secondary panel. He sat back for a moment. His shoulder ached from the impact on the ladder. He could feel the cold of the metal deck through his jeans. Grace said, "You knew exactly where that switch was." He said, "I wrote it down this morning." She did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice held none of the registers he had heard from her before. She said, "I know," Dominic said. "The navigation lights need a clean feed from the forward battery bank. Can you hold this connection point while I run the bypass?" Grace said, "Tell me what to do." He told her. She did it. Her hands in the amber light were steady, and there was motor oil on the cuff of her blazer, and neither of them mentioned it. The work took 63 minutes in total. Dominic isolated the 3 shorted circuits by removing their breakers entirely and capping the leads with heat-shrink terminals, preventing any further ground fault from propagating. It was a permanent removal. The circuits would need proper repair at dock, but it was stable, and stability was the only criterion that mattered. He ran a direct feed from the forward battery bank to the bilge pump motor, bypassing the compromised panel. The pump came up to full speed and held there. He restored the navigation lights on their own isolated circuit, red to port, green to starboard, white at the stern. The tender pilot radioed that he could see them. That fact, lights visible from outside, changed the character of the situation in a way no technical description could capture. A vessel with navigation lights is a vessel in the system. He got the emergency radio onto its dedicated battery and confirmed it was transmitting on the distress channel at full power. He talked to the Coast Guard cutter directly, gave them the vessel's position, the nature of the casualty, and the passenger count. The cutter commander confirmed ETA at 47 minutes. At the 41-minute mark, the backup battery for the secondary bilge pump showed a low-voltage warning. One of the battery cells had discharged faster than the others due to the uneven draw from the shorted panel. Dominic had one option: run the backup generator for a maximum of 8 minutes using the original bearing from the ship's spare parts locker. It did not perfectly match the modified generator spec, but was close enough to run on reduced load for a short time if he could reshape the housing fit with the tools available. Hunter said, "That's insane. You'll blow the whole unit." Dominic said, "The unit is already done. I'm not saving it. I'm using it for 8 minutes." Hunter said, "What if it catches fire?" Dominic said, "Then I put it out. The fire suppression system in this compartment is still on its own dry cell backup." He looked at Hunter for exactly 1 second. He said, "Every minute we debate this is a minute of battery the bilge pump is using. So either help or go upstairs." Grace said, "Do it." Hunter went upstairs. The improvised fit took 22 minutes of precise filing. Adrian held the workpiece. Grace held the light. Garrett managed the cooling valve on Dominic's instruction. When Dominic fitted the modified bearing and brought the generator up on minimum load bilge pump circuit, only it ran. It ran for 9 minutes and 40 seconds before the vibration crossed the safe threshold, and Dominic shut it down. In that time, the main battery bank had recovered enough charge to run the bilge pump for an additional 2 hours. That was enough. At the 44-minute mark, an irregular swell rolled in broadside. The deck shifted hard. Grace was crossing the engine room toward the forward ladder when the motion hit, and she lost her footing and went sideways toward the area near the aft electrical panel where Dominic had capped the shorted leads but had not yet finished insulating the outer casing. Dominic moved. He caught her by the arm and pulled her clear, and the two of them ended up against the starboard hull together, his hand around her forearm, her shoulder against his. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," he said. "The leads under the panel are still hot on the upstream side. Don't stand there." She nodded, moved forward to the ladder, and climbed more carefully. The Coast Guard cutter made contact 49 minutes after Dominic had restored the navigation lights. A tow line was rigged. With the immediate crisis resolved, the engine room went quiet for the first time since the generator failure. Dominic checked the bilge pump output one final time and sat down on the lower step of the ladder. Grace came back down. She had found a rag somewhere and wiped most of the surface oil from her hands, which had the slightly absurd effect of making the motor oil on her blazer cuff more visible by contrast. She stood across from him and she said, "I want to apologize." Dominic said, "Go ahead," she said. "What I said this morning was wrong. Not just incorrect. I mean, it was wrong, the way something is wrong. When you use what you know about a person's situation to make them feel small, I did that deliberately. And I'm sorry." Dominic said, "Can I tell you what bothered me most?" Grace said yes. He said, "My daughter was standing on the dock. She's 6 years old. She was watching me work, the way she always does when she comes with me. And she heard you call her father a broke single father trying to intimidate people for extra money." The engine room was quiet. Dominic said, "I've been called worse. I don't care what people think of me, but she thinks I'm the best person in the world, the way little kids think about their parents." And she stood there and watched a woman she had never met try to take that apart in front of a crowd. Grace was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, she did not offer context or explanation. She said, "I was wrong about that. Specifically about that. And I'm sorry to her." Dominic said, "The apology that matters needs to go to her directly." He said it without aggression. He said it the way someone states a fact that will not move regardless of how it is received. He also said, "Being sorry means something if it changes how you treat people who can't push back against you. It doesn't mean much if it's just a feeling you have in a dark engine room." Grace received that in silence. She did not flinch from it. And Dominic noticed that. It was not nothing. A person taking an accurate criticism without trying to redirect it. Catherine appeared at the engine room door. She looked from Grace to Dominic and back. She said, "The guests are stable. The cutter crew is going to come aboard. They'll want a casualty report." Dominic stood up. He said, "Adrian should brief them. He was aboard for the whole sequence." Catherine nodded. Then she said to Dominic, "Thank you." He said, "It was the job." She said, "It wasn't actually, but I understand why you'd say that." Attaching the tow line to the Celestia in 4-foot swells required coordination between the cutter crew, the tender pilot, and whoever on the yacht could manage the forward mooring cleats. Adrian, with his shoulder injury, could not do it alone. The cutter had sent 2 of its own people aboard by inflatable, but they were unfamiliar with the Celestia's forward deck configuration, and the cleat positions were not standard. Dominic went forward. The foredeck of a drifting vessel in open water is not a comfortable place to work. The hull was moving in 3 axes, simultaneously pitching with the swells, rolling in the trough, and yawing as the beam-to-wind orientation shifted. Dominic had spent enough time on working boats to move on a moving deck without thinking about it, which was the difference between someone who had absorbed the motion intellectually and someone whose body had simply learned it. One of the cutter crew, a young sailor, perhaps 22, was trying to take a rap on the forward port cleat when a larger set came through. The boat lifted hard, and the sailor went to one knee and then to his side, sliding toward the rail. Dominic moved fast, reaching, getting a hand on the sailor's jacket, redirecting the slide. The sailor found purchase and stood up. Wide-eyed, Dominic said, "Stay low and toward center line until the line is secured." The sailor did exactly that. The tow line was made fast in 4 minutes. The line came taut. The Celestia's yaw steadied. Grace had watched from the main deck. She had seen Dominic move, and she had said his name before she thought about it, loudly, with a fear in her voice that surprised her. He had not heard it. He was already managing the next problem. She watched him on the foredeck in the gray afternoon light with oil on his forearms, talking to the cutter crew with the same unhurried precision he had used in the engine room and on the dock that morning. He was exactly the same person in every context. She understood now that this was not ordinary at all. When he finally came aft through the salon, he was moving more carefully than before, and she could see from the set of his left shoulder that the arm was hurting. He sat down on the aft bench and took the small yellow handkerchief from his breast pocket and wiped the salt water and grime from his face with the concentrated attention of a practiced private ritual. Grace sat down nearby. She did not speak. She watched the tow line pulling the Celestia slowly back toward home, sitting with the particular weight of someone who has seen who they actually are and is deciding what to do about it. The Celestia was brought into Bayside Point just before 5 in the morning. The sky above the marina, that particular shade of dark blue that precedes dawn without quite being it. The marina's work lights were on. A small crowd had gathered dock workers. A few boat owners who had heard the radio traffic. The marina manager. Owen was there. And Xavier. And Madison, who had fallen asleep on Owen's office couch and been woken when the first lights of the returning vessels appeared at the channel mouth. She saw her father before he was fully off the gangway, and she ran. Dominic caught her, and the motion of catching her crouching to her level, lifting her up, holding her against his chest was the first movement all day that had nothing careful or calculated about it. He was tired in a way that was visible in his posture, and he stood with his eyes closed for a moment while she held on. He said, "I'm back." She said, "I know. I watched the whole time." She set her feet back on the dock and took his hand. She examined the bruise rising on his forearm where the ladder had caught him, and she touched it very gently. And he said it was nothing, and she said it was not nothing. Grace came down the gangway behind her crew. She was, for the first time in recent memory, not the best-dressed person at her own event. Her blazer was beyond salvage. She was wearing a borrowed cable-knit sweater from one of the cutter crew over her blouse. She had her hair tied back with what appeared to be a cable tie from the engine room. She stopped walking when she saw Madison. The little girl looked at her with the direct attention of children, who have not yet developed the social reflex of looking away when looking is uncomfortable. Grace crossed the dock and crouched down. She said, "You're Madison." Madison said, "Yes." Grace said, "My name is Grace. I said something this morning that was unkind about your father. I said it in front of other people, and it was wrong. And I'm sorry. I'm telling you directly because it affected you. And you deserve to hear the apology." Madison looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at her father. Dominic said nothing. He did not instruct her. Madison turned back to Grace and said, "My dad said that saying sorry is only part of it." Grace said, "He's right. The rest of it is what you do after." Madison seemed to find this acceptable. She did not offer her hand or say that everything was fine, because she was 6 years old and understood intuitively that some things are not instantly fine, and that pretending otherwise is a form of lying. She just looked at Grace steadily and then leaned back against her father's leg. By the end of the following day, 3 things had happened. Hunter Pierce was placed on suspension pending an internal review, with particular attention to the decision to discard the technical warning note. Adrian Cole submitted a full written account of the morning's inspection, acknowledging that he had failed to halt departure against his own better judgment, and Grace had called Owen's yard and asked him to quote, "the complete cost of the rescue and repair operation," which she intended to pay in full. Dominic was not present for any of these developments. He had taken Madison home to sleep. 3 weeks later, Grace arrived at Owen's yard on a Tuesday morning. She came alone, no assistant, no driver, no camera crew. She drove a vehicle that was deliberately unremarkable, which was the kind of deliberateness that is itself a statement when you are someone who could afford otherwise. Dominic was in the bay, working on a small, inboard diesel. Madison was doing homework at the workbench table, her pencil case laid out with the organizational seriousness of a child who considers her school supplies important. Grace stood at the bay entrance for a moment before either of them looked up. She described her proposal in clear terms. She was establishing a maritime safety review program, independent of her company's operations division, with the authority to halt any vessel departure if the designated reviewer identified a safety risk that had not been adequately addressed. She wanted Dominic to serve as lead technical advisor, with the right to access any vessel in her fleet, and the right to say no to anyone, including her. The program would also fund apprenticeship positions for young marine technicians from working-class backgrounds who had the knowledge but not the institutional credentials. She mentioned Xavier by name. Dominic listened to all of it. He said, "How do I know this isn't a PR repair job?" Grace said, "You don't. Not yet. I can't prove intent in advance, but the structure I'm describing, independent authority, unedited reports, real consequences for overrides, that's not something you build for appearances. That costs more than a press release." Dominic was quiet. Madison looked up from her homework. She said, "I like it when people listen to Dad." Grace said, "I'm starting to understand why." Dominic said he would think about it. He said he would want Xavier involved in any apprenticeship program design, not just as a recipient, but as someone with input on how it should work. Grace said that was reasonable. Before she left, she took out a handwritten envelope addressed to Madison Hale. Madison opened it. Inside was a card on which Grace had written, in plain language, that being wrong was not the worst thing a person could do. The worst thing was to be wrong, and refuse to see it. And that Madison's father had shown more courage than most people Grace had ever met. Madison read it twice, put it back carefully, and said, "Thank you." Grace said, "Thank your father." 6 months after the night, the Celestia drifted dark off the Rhode Island coast. The Maritime Safety Review Program launched at a small ceremony at Bayside Point Marina. There was no red carpet. There was a portable speaker playing something low and acoustic, coffee and pastries Owen had brought from a nearby bakery, and perhaps 60 people, dock workers, marine technicians, a few journalists, 2 Coast Guard station representatives, and a handful of the investors who had been on the Celestia that October afternoon. A banner on the chain-link fence at the yard entrance read, "Maritime Safety Review Initiative. Independent. Technical. No exceptions." Grace spoke for 6 minutes. She did not use slides. She said that the most instructive experience of her professional life had not occurred in a boardroom. It had occurred on a dark deck with a failed engine, where the only person who knew what to do was a man she had publicly dismissed 6 hours earlier, who had come out to help anyway. She said the program existed because she had been wrong in a way that risked 31 lives, and that was not something she was willing to simply move on from. It was something she was obligated to build a system around. Dominic stood near the back of the group with Madison beside him. He had a paper cup of coffee. He was wearing the same type of plain work shirt he always wore. When Grace finished and invited him to say a few words, he walked to the front with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything. He said, "On any vessel, the machines are always communicating. A temperature reading, a vibration, a smell that wasn't there yesterday. These are not alarms. They're sentences. The machines almost always give you time to respond, if you're listening. The problem is almost never the machine. The problem is the willingness to hear something that makes the next decision harder." He thanked Owen. He thanked Xavier. He said nothing further and stepped back. Madison reached up and took his hand. Later, Walking back along the dock toward the truck, she said, "Is Grace a good person now?" Dominic thought about it. He said, "I think she might be becoming one. That's different from being one already. But it might be better. It means she's doing it on purpose." Madison appeared to find this satisfactory. The Celestia was visible from the dock, resupplied and refitted in her slip, hull clean and white in the winter sun. She had been repainted around the bow, where the tow line had left marks, and the engine room had been entirely rewired following Dominic's specifications. She looked, from a distance, exactly as she had always looked, but she was not quite the same boat, and the people who had been on her knew it. Some lessons arrive the way the ocean delivers them, not when you are ready, and not gently, but with enough force that you carry the mark of them for the rest of your life.